all we came to be happy again. Back to the river again.
Hey everybody, Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and I'm doing a little something on Chris Hillman. And I'm going to give you a very brief little synopsis up to his first recordings, and then I'll start showing you some of his albums that he participated in starting when he was about 18 years old. Chris Hillman grew up in California. His father was an advertising executive and during part of his childhood, and then a newspaper owner. He grew up in a small town called Rancho Santa Fe, somewhere near San Diego. I'm not great with my geography of California. A nice childhood until his mid-teens when tragedy struck, but did all the things kids did in a small town. He learned to ride horses, enjoyed riding horses as a kid. By the time he was, 11, 12, 13 years old, he started surfing, and riding scooters was a big thing, just hanging out in small town life. So some pretty nice way to live. But excuse me. But unfortunately, his father committed suicide when Chris was about a sophomore or so in high school. Some financial difficulties, and evidently father had gone into a deep depression that people weren't really perceptive of at the time, and he took his life. And I think that had a profound effect on Chris, or as it would anyone growing up or even into their adulthood that's had that sort of tragedy in their family. But trying to work on beyond the death of his father, when he was about 15 or so, he took up the guitar and started learning to play the guitar and then the mandolin. And he was going, as a high schooler, he was going up to LA sometimes, to the Ash Grove, to hear some of the folk artists. That was where his interest was. His sister, I believe it was, came home from college, and she had, some Peter, Paul and Mary and the Weavers, and some of those folk artists, Flat and Scruggs, I think, maybe, and things like that. And he started getting into the music. And plus, there's a strong country and folk tradition in California. And soon after he got out of high school, he joined a bluegrass band called the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers. And this is their one and only album. And you can see Chris is the one playing the mandolin. Interesting story about this. He was back in San Diego area with this band. That's where they were based out of, fresh out of high school. And they knew from some Dillard's albums that Jim Dixon, and that name, anybody into the LA music scene knows who is well versed in that, knows who Jim Dixon is. Went on to produce a lot of the rock acts too, but he was real big into bluegrass and folk type music in the early 60s. So this would have been 1963, and they called up Jim Dixon at World Pacific, I believe it is, Studios, and Dixon happened to be there when they called. He picked up the phone, he talked to him, and he says, "Well, why don't y'all come over and play a few tunes for me?" They came over to his studio. They played. He liked what he heard. He said, "I really don't have any place for you right now, but let me call the guys over at Crown, and they might be able to do something with you." So he was kind enough to call Crown Records, and they said, "Yeah, come on over." And if you're familiar with Crown Records, they are not this big time record label. Their bread and butter were quickly putting out cheaply made records and not marketing to record stores or anything like that, but these Crown records would appear in supermarkets and five and dime stores and things like that, marked low, not very expensive, that sort of thing. They said, yeah, come on over. They went on over. They said, well, yeah, let's record you right now. And so they recorded them on recorded it and mixed it while they were playing live, no overdubs, on a two-track recording. It was a two-track recording, and they mixed it right there. It took them 4 hours to record and mix the album. They then went out to a park right after they did it and took this picture. So they had their artwork, and within a couple of weeks, they had the album pressed. Each member got a box of 10 albums and a little stipend. I think maybe $100 a piece, or maybe even less than that. But they got paid, and that's the only money they ever saw from it. They made sure that all the songs on here were public domain, so the label had to pay no royalties to anybody else. So anything they sold, basically after they paid the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers paid them for recording and gave them, there's 5 of them, 5 times 50 records. That was pretty much it. Anything else was profit for them. So that's and Chris says actually this is a darn good recording. He said we were young, we were ambitious, we were a hot band, well rehearsed. We got in there and just put that thing out, just recorded it just as well as we could. And he got his first lead vocals. He did the lead vocals on the song Reuben. So that's his first band. Now, they were playing at the Hootenannies at the Troubadour in L.A. They would come up from San Diego and play the Troubadour in L.A. And one of the guys owned a record store, music store in the San Diego area called the Blue Guitar. One of the members, that was his store. And they would play regular dates there, and they'd play wherever they got a chance. They played at Disney. So soon after they made that album, 2 of the band members got their draft notice, and rather than wait to be drafted into the Army, they volunteered for the Air Force, and the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers were no more. But if you can find this album, you've got a kind of a rarity, because I don't know how many they made. But so Hillman then hooks up with another group of bluegrass musicians. It's a small network, in the California area. There weren't that many bluegrass bands. There were the Dillards. There were the White Brothers, which would become known as the Kentucky Colonels, Clarence and Roland White, among others, in that band. And there were the Golden State Boys. And Chris Hillman became the mandolin player and harmony vocalist member of the Golden State Boys. Now, they consisted of, and they became known when they re-released the album years later. They changed the name of the group to the Hillman. The record executives decided to do that when they finally released these recordings. They were always the Golden State Boys, but the album was issued long after they had disbanded, and they labeled them the Hillman, probably because Chris Hillman had become famous as a member of the Byrds. And the Hillman consisted, so then this is a second issue of, or a reissue of this album from the Golden State Boys. It consisted of Chris Hillman, who at this point, this is 1963, so he's 19 years old at this point. Don Parmley, who would go on, he played the banjo, he would go on and form one of the great bluegrass bands that would relocate to the East Coast, to the Mid-Atlantic area, the Virginia Cardinals, and the Bluegrass Cardinals. Where did I get Virginia Cardinals? They relocated to Virginia. They were the Bluegrass Cardinals. Don Parmley, for many, many years, his band toured extensively, very successful bluegrass band. I saw them a few times at some bluegrass festivals. And the other two members were two brothers, Rex and Vern Gosden. And Rex wrote a lot of songs later on in country music that got recorded by a lot of artists. But Vern Gosden was the most successful of those Hillman, along with Chris Hillman, as a solo artist. He was one of the great country vocalists in the 1970s and 80s. I love me some Vern Gosden. If you ever see Vern Gosden records in the wild, grab them. If you like country music, great voice. You also may know him from Gene Clark, who had been in the Byrds. The Gosden brothers recorded an album with Gene Clark. Okay, so this is the Hillman. A really nice album. Sugar Hill re-released this after its original release, and again, it wasn't released at the time it was recorded. And this is another case of just, something very quick. This time they're actually recording at World Pacific Studios with Jim Dixon overseeing what's going on. And they had moved up one track. This was in 63 and 64 they recorded this in L.A. And this time they're using a 3-track machine instead of a 2-track. And no live takes, no overdubs, nothing. Okay, that's a nice album. Fairly easy to find. You pick that up. Sugar Hill put that out. Okay, so that gets us through Hillman's bluegrass days. He got a call in 65 or so. Dixon was putting together another band. And they had Roger McGuinn and David Crosby and Gene Clark, and they needed a bass player, and they needed a drummer. Well, you got Michael Clark, I believe it was, as the drummer, and they brought in, they called Chris Hillman up. Dixon, I believe, is the one that called him up. Called him up and said, we're putting this band together. We need a bass player, and he was, starving musician at this point. So they said, can you play bass? And he said, sure, I can play bass. Now he played guitar and he played mandolin being his main instrument. So he was lying. He quickly borrowed somebody's bass and said, show me how to play this. And he shows up, and at first he's a contract player, not even contract. He's not on the contract as the Byrds in those very first recordings. Mr. Tambourine Man, for instance, and he doesn't actually play on that. In fact, nobody but Roger McGuinn plays an instrument on Mr. Tambourine Man. But Hillman is a member on the back line with Michael Clark, or Mike Clark, playing the drums, and Crosby, McGuinn, and Gene Clark on the front line doing the vocals. And okay, here's a Columbia 2i in mono of the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man. So while they weren't on the single, the Wrecking Crew did the single, Mr. Tambourine Man, and a couple other songs. They were included in the other songs that made up this album. So this would take us to about, 65, I believe. And he would go on, and Chris Hillman was part of the Byrds through about 68, I believe it was. Of course, now my copy of Turn, Turn, Turn is one of those twofers. This is Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, Turn, Turn. And funny thing with this, they all had that Beatles haircut. As was the thing at that time. And Chris Hillman's hair was very curly. So he had a devil of a time straightening his hair out. Before every show, he would get out there and iron his hair to get it as straight as he could, which worked okay in dry climates. But when you get somewhere where there's a lot of humidity, you do all that work, and then as soon as you go outside, it curls right back up. But I think he was part of six albums for the Byrds. Fifth Dimension being another. Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, 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 Fifth Dimension, Younger Than Yesterday, and another one. And then, of course, the Sweetheart of the Rodeo album, this very, very important album in the list of important albums of the 60s. Always like that cover. And so this is Hillman. This is when Graham Parsons joins the Byrds, or he's actually a paid employee of the Byrds. He wasn't actually a full-fledged member, I don't believe. But Parsons had a lot of influence. And Hillman and Parsons reconnect pretty shortly after that. And they form a band that is one of those bands that never sold any records at the time, but is considered a classic, extremely important band, and that is the Flying Burrito Brothers. That's Chris in the blue. When they got the record contract, they went out and bought these. We'd call them nudie suits, but they're really not nudie suits. They're made by one of the tailors in the L.A. area. But Hillman's not worried about his hair this time. He's just letting it be natural. And this is one of those great iconic albums, of course. And Hillman co-wrote several of the classics on here. Christina's Tune, he co-wrote with Graham Parsons. Sin City, one of my favorites, he co-wrote with Graham. My Uncle, which probably the weakest song on here. Some people may take exception with that, but I guess it's because it's kind of dated. It's not it doesn't age as well as most of the other songs. Wheels, Juanita, and Hippie Boy. Yep, Hippie Boy doesn't age very well either. He wrote that one with Parsons. So about 5 or 6 of these are co-writes, Hillman and Parsons. And so Flying Burrito Brothers, that's 1969 when this came out. What a great album. They hit it out of the park with that album. And the Burrito Brothers were kind of disintegrating. Graham was dealing with a lot of personal issues, and they put out Burrito Deluxe. This was a good album. I always liked this album, but it's definitely not in the same league with Gilded Palace of Sin. The songwriting is not nearly as strong. Not nearly as many older guys, Hillman and Parsons, and Bernie Leadon has joined the band at this point. They do together. Bernie Leadon has written a couple of these. Down in the Churchyard, Hillman and Parsons did together, but it's just not as strong an album as the Gilded Palace of Sin is. And Parsons is fired from the band. Hillman continues with the Flying Burrito Brothers, and they put out, I think it was 71, this album came out. This is a good album. It's not bad at all. Nothing revolutionary about this one by any means. But they take in a new singer, guitarist, Rick Roberts, who proves to be very good. Sneaky Pete's still in the band, of course. Hillman's playing the bass again, and he had switched to guitar for a little while. But when they added Roberts, he's able to go back to the bass. And Bernie Leadon's still on here. Sneaky Pete, like I said, still on here. So this is a good album. It's not Roberts does most of the songwriting on here, most of the best songwriting. The song Colorado is on here, and that's really good. Rick Roberts would stay with the band. Hillman would leave soon after this, but they'll do one more album before Hillman leaves. Rick Roberts would stay with the band one more album after that, and then he'll go on and form the band Firefall, which had some success. But Roberts writes almost all the songs on here that aren't covers. Like there's a Merle Haggard cover on here. There is a Gene Clark song on here, and a Bob Dylan song. Okay, and then the last of the Burrito Brothers albums that Chris Hillman is a part of is this one, a live album, and this is Last of the Red Hot Burritos, and it gives you kind of a look at all the people that were members at different times up to that point with the Flying Burrito Brothers. This is a live album, so it's pretty much what you would expect from it. It's not a bad album, produced by Jim Dixon. Not a bad album, but there's nothing that's going to just blow you away. But at this point, Hillman leaves the Flying Burrito Brothers. Flying Burrito Brothers would continue on even up to today in various configurations, but Hillman would have no more involvement with that particular title for a band up to that point. I'm sure he could very easily have taken that moniker and run with it if he had wanted during different points in his career. Hillman would go back all the original Byrds, Clark, both Clarks, Gene and Michael, Crosby, McGuinn, and Hillman would reform the original Byrds in '73 to do this album. And it's a good album. I like this album, but it's not it wasn't a permanent situation. The Clarence White era Byrds, McGuinn temporarily disbanded them and formed this band. I think probably having to do more with ownership of the name, establishing firm ownership of the name, the Byrds, than anything else. So Hillman, when he leaves the Burrito Brothers, Flying Burrito Brothers, he goes to work. Stephen Stills is putting together a band, and it's kind of murky. Is this the band Manassas, or is this Stephen Stills with a backing band called Manassas, or is it all one? I mean, you take it for what it's worth. Stephen Stills was the biggest name here, but they did this album. This is a very good album, Stephen Stills Manassas, and it's got all their names here, including Chris Hillman. Al Perkins is on here. He would work a lot with them, and this is a neat album. The way it's put together in different kind of themes for each side of the album. But it's pretty much Stephen Stills' brainchild. And then they would do one more album together before Manassas would fall apart. Okay? And there it is. And look for the white guy with the afro, and you have found Chris Hillman there. Okay? And this one Down the Road. And again, they all get equal billing, except for it's got Stephen Stills, Manassas, and all their names here. Okay. And that kind of fizzles out after a while. And different ways of putting together recording contracts take place by the mid 70s. I couldn't find a Souther, Hillman, and Furay album in my collection. I thought I had one, and I probably do have it. They made two, but it was an attempt, kind of like a Crosby, Stills, and Nash. You got Souther, Hillman, and Furay. Souther, J.D. Souther, being the great songwriter. Somebody else can reel off the names of the bands he was in. I think of him most importantly as a songwriter that Linda Ronstadt recorded so many songs for. There's a good album by him, Black Rose, not to be confused with the Billy Joe Schaefer song called Black Rose. And Richie Furay, let's see, wasn't Richie Furay in Buffalo Springfield and Poco? I believe so. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that's one of his solo albums, Richie Furay. And they really, it didn't work. They did 2 albums together, I believe, and sometimes when it's artificially created, the executives say, "Wow, 3 great important artists. We'll put you all together. You're really good songwriters. Put you all together, and it'll be 3 times as good." No, sometimes the individuals are better than the whole, and that is the case. They also tried in the mid '70s McGuinn Clark and Hillman, Gene Clark meaning. This is look at the way they're dressed. That one. That's the way this album sounds. I like each of these 3 artists, but I have never. This album just does nothing for me. It got too LA slick, too California country rock slick. Instead of going more pure, it became more uptown, and it just doesn't do anything for me. Hillman, over the years, maybe he's got a bunch of solo albums. For the major labels, he put out several. I believe this is an Asylum right here. This is the second on Asylum. We're talking about the singer-songwriter era, and this is Clear Sailing. They're okay. There's nothing wrong with them. But to me, when he goes more acoustic, more rootsy, the better. And he also recorded for the Sugar Hill label. Now, this is my favorite solo Chris Hillman album right here. This is a really good album. And Herb Peterson is on this album. He met Herb Peterson in about 1963 or 4. He was also in, I think, Pine Valley Boys was his bluegrass band in California, from Berkeley and down into L.A. He and Herb Peterson were constantly collaborating. They've got one duo album, and if you've got a Herb Peterson album, you look on it, Chris Hillman will be on there. If you've got a Chris Hillman solo album, look on it. Herb Peterson will be on there. But Morning Sky is a really good one. In the early to mid 80s, I think this one, the one I'm going to show you, is like 83, I believe, or so. 87, okay, later into the 80s. They've been doing a lot of what we call today Americana stuff, and they said, well, let's do more of an electric, more of a Bakersfield sound. Get in some more electric guitars and steel guitar and things like that, and maybe we can tap into the country market now. And it was a very very pure effort. They really did a good job, and they formed a band called the Desert Rose Band, and that would be Herb Peterson, Chris Hillman, and John Jorgensen, and J.D. Maines on steel guitar during much of the time, Steve Duncan on the drums, and Bill Bryson on this album on the bass. He wasn't always the bass player, I don't believe. But they got a deal with Curb Records, and they put out several albums intending, and singles, the Desert Rose Band, with the intention of appealing to country radio. By 1987, we've gotten into that new traditionalist period, and they said, maybe there's a place for a nice, some nice harmonies and some, West Coast sounding country music in the tradition of Bakersfield, that sort of thing. And they did several albums on Curb. Unfortunately, Curb was the label, and it was distributed by, I guess, Warner Brothers, wouldn't it be, or MCA, distributed by MCA. And they just never did get. Hillman said the biggest problem with the Desert Rose Band, they were getting lots of work. They were opening on tours for the Oak Ridge Boys, who were big during that time. They were playing, the state fairs. They were playing the bigger shows that paid well, and they were getting top top 10 singles on the country charts for a period of, I don't know, 5 or more years. They were getting it. The problem was they would go play a state fair somewhere in the Midwest, and they would go into the record stores in that town that day and thumb through the record bins, and they would not see their record for sale. So people would go see them and like them, but it was hard to find their albums. The distribution just wasn't there. MCA wasn't supporting the curb artists like they should have. So the Desert Rose Band. Now, Hillman's in his 70s now, and he put out 2000. He put out in 2017, Biding My Time, I believe is the name of it, and it was produced by Tom Petty. A really good album. I have the CD, but I don't have the album, the vinyl copy, so me trying to dig through those boxes of my CDs would take me forever, so I'm not going to show you that. But just to show you, 3 or 4 years ago, he was still recording music. He's an amazing artist. As a solo artist, he's played in some of the greatest bands of all time, and just a neat artist. So that's just kind of a brief look and an incomplete look at the discography of Chris Hillman. So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe you saw an album or two you might want to pick up, and I will remind you, be kind to your neighbors, folks, because we're all neighbors.